Well, good morning. My name is Dave. We have not met, and I have the privilege of leading our amazing worship team. Could we give it up for them? And today is a little bit different because I get to be on stage and get to share God's word with you, which I consider a privilege to do. And I'm going to be continuing with us in the book of James. So if you have a Bible with you, you can feel free to turn to chapter 4 of the book of James. And we are going to begin reading in verse 13. Verse 13 says this. It says, "Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town, and we'll stay there for a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it." So if you're just joining us today, maybe for the first time, or if you're unfamiliar with this book, this was written by James, who was a brother of Jesus. He was a leader of the Jerusalem church. And it was written to Jewish Christians, largely, many which were suffering persecution, and many which who were living in poverty. And last week, Pastor Bill began chapter 4, and it included James saying these words in verse 6. It says, "God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." And I think that's important to remember. So I want you to just kind of keep that phrase in the back of your mind as we go through these verses. So what James is doing is he's addressing these different kinds of people that are just not acting right. They're stirring up dissension. Some are driven by jealousy. Some are being unfaithful. Some he calls enemies of God. Some are critical and judgmental. And now as chapter 4 closes, we come to the worst of the worst. People who plan too much. Any planners in the room? Okay. It's going to be okay, guys. I promise. It'll be okay. And the problem is not just in planning too much, though, as I hope we'll see. So how many of you guys, you like to read more than one translation of the Bible? Maybe on your phone, or you own different translations. I like doing that. It's not required to be a Christian, but I like to read a few different translations when studying language, because words are tough, right? Language can be complicated. And so I want to reread these first few verses in what's called the Message translation, because I think you get really the force of what James is trying to say. So he says it this way: "And now I have a word for you who brashly announce, today, at the latest tomorrow, we're off to such and such a city for the year. We're going to start a business and make a lot of money. You don't know the first thing about tomorrow. You are nothing but a wisp of fog, catching a brief bit of sun before disappearing. Instead, make it a habit to say, if the master wills it, and we're still alive, we'll do this or that." I wonder if any of you guys have ever made a plan without involving all the necessary people. So I can relate to this as a parent. I have 4 kids, 2 who are almost 13, and then a 9 and a 7-year-old. And my kids have often come to say, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to hang out with so-and-so." And I said, "Oh, okay. Are you planning to walk there?" And they said, "Oh, no. I guess I maybe should have talked to you first before making a plan." How about as a spouse? I wonder if you've ever made a plan without involving your spouse. Now, I don't play golf, but I've seen through many a meme that apparently this happens with golf, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. In these verses, James warns against an arrogance of presuming that we are in control of our life and our future. And he speaks out against people who make these elaborate plans. And these plans, they're not just plans. They are plans with a very specific purpose. So what's the purpose? Well, it says here in one of the opening verses, he says, we're off to such and such a city for the year. We're going to start a business and make a lot of money. Say to someone next to you, make a lot of money. Now, well, what's the problem with that, you may ask, right? We all need to make money to make a living and to pay for bills and to buy groceries. Yeah, the problem is not with money itself. The problem, I think, is that in all the planning that these people are doing, there is no consideration, there is no allowance for God in the plans. God, what would you have me do? What would you have me, where would you have me go? What would you have me say? What would you have my priorities to be? Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. So you don't want to make plans in your life and never consider the one who matters most in the plan making. So who may have plans for you that far exceed what you could imagine or plan for yourself. Have you guys ever experienced that where you make plans and God's like, no, I have different plans for you? It reminds me of King David when he says, God, I want to build you a house, right? And what does God say back to him through the prophet? He's like, no, I'm good. In fact, I'm going to establish a kingdom for you that will last forever. And I wonder if David was thinking, like, but God, your house is going to have gold in it. He probably didn't say that. He was like, wow, that's better than the plans I had made with my own life. But I think a lot of us, especially those who plan a lot, we feel this sense of urgency because we are aware that our time is limited. Our life on earth here is incredibly short. And as we get older, we're consistently reminded of the fragility of life, right? We lose people that we love. We make mistakes. We're confronted with our own mortality. And what James reminds us of is that my life, your life, is like a vapor. It's here today and gone tomorrow. So I work as a chaplain in a school. And part of my role as a chaplain is I teach Bible classes to middle and high school students. And a few years ago, I remember I was teaching a group of high school kids, and I was talking about how when we grow up, we all construct a view of the world and even of God based on whatever, whether we're 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. But eventually what happens is we experience something tough, difficult, unexpected. And in some way, it deconstructs that worldview, and we're not sure what to do with it. And my point is that mature faith, mature Christianity, takes that experience and then can eventually reconstruct a view of God that includes difficulty, that includes even maybe suffering. And there was a young man sitting in the back row, back corner, listening very politely. And a few days later, his only sibling, older brother, died in a car accident. See, our life is like a vapor. It's incredibly fragile. God, in nowhere in his word, promises us a certain amount of days. But what he's given to us is today. And he promises that today he is here with us. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't make plans for tomorrow. Jesus himself made plans while he was here on earth. Jesus was, by all accommodations, busy. In fact, often he was exhausted from the work that he was doing. But have you ever noticed in many of the interactions that we have of Jesus in the Gospels, the things that happen on the way to where he's going? Now, many of us, I think we would call these things distractions. I think Jesus would consider them divine appointments. And what if in all the planning and the preparations that we do for our days, our weeks, our months, our years, what if the real opportunities happen in what we would consider the distractions, or getting to the event, to the thing that we're planning for? The unplanned interactions. Now, I don't think that James is being anti-plans, but I think he's urging us to have some humility in our planning. Do you notice what the Message version said? Is that if the master wills it, and what? If we're still alive, then we'll do this or we'll do that. There is a consideration, there's a humility of where life itself comes from. Said, instead, make it a habit to say, if God wills it, and if we're still alive, we'll do this or that. Now, this group that James is talking about, they're planning for a purpose, right? And what's the purpose? The purpose is to make a lot of money. And these plans in other translations are not called plans, they're called schemes. Verse 16 in some translations says, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. Now, there's a difference between a plan and a scheme, isn't there? I wonder if you've ever been a part of a scheme. I have. Would you guys like to hear about it? Okay. So my first year in college, a friend of mine, he had a bright idea to go into New York City and to buy Rolexes on the street. Now, the thing about Rolexes is that they're usually not sold in the street. And so these were Rolexes that looked like Rolexes, but were not actually Rolexes. Now, for any kids in the room, this is wrong. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. So there's a group of us that went and bought some of these watches, and a friend of mine who was a college roommate bought and sold a couple of these things, made a couple $100, and he bought with it a samurai sword. And he hung the samurai sword in our college dorm room from cheap wire hangers, if you can just imagine this picture. Okay, that felt much more like a scheme than a plan. Now, many of you at work, I imagine, have planning meetings, right? Whether you're working for a nonprofit or in a corporate environment, creative brainstorming, whatever you may call it. Imagine getting an email invite to a 3 p.m. scheming meeting in the conference room. You probably wouldn't know how to feel about that, right? You may be like, wow, I really want to go to see what this is all about. Or if the person in charge of a planning meeting began the meeting by saying, ladies and gentlemen, I have hatched a plot. You'd be like, is like Scooby-Doo going to come and like unmask someone at the end of this meeting, right? This seems a little nefarious. So these people that James is addressing are essentially saying, we've hatched a plot to go to this city, start a business, and make a lot of money. There's no consideration for God or what he may want us to do. It feels to me much more like a scheme. Now, you and I probably wouldn't come out and say that with some of the plans that we've made in our own life. But I think if we're honest, some of us have made plans or been a part of plans, sometimes regarding money, sometimes not, that maybe haven't been the most honorable. That maybe just something about it didn't feel right. That we may knowingly or even unknowingly take advantage of a person or a group. And verse 17 is not unclear here. It says this, he says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. often it's not the things that we're ignorant of. You and I know the right things to do, and we just don't want to do it. Now, James is not arguing areas of gray. Like you and I could find a lot of things to debate about whether what's right and what's wrong, and there could both be valid sides of the argument. These are not things that are areas of gray. He's saying, look, where it's clear what the right thing is to do, act honorably. Act like you believe in what's right and wrong. Otherwise, it's just words. So, let's move on to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, James is going to address specifically the wealthy and the oppression of those who are used by them in gaining their wealth. So let's read together starting in verse 1 of chapter 5. It says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." So something to remember about the time period in which it was written, the Roman society in the first century was marked by very stark disparities of wealth, where the rich often exploited the poor to become more rich. And the lifestyle of the wealthy stood in direct contrast to the struggles of the less fortunate. And James has some strong words for this society, condemning the hoarding of riches and the mistreatment of the poor. One of the things that I think this context reminds us of is that Christianity, over and above being a faith in a risen Jesus, is also a lifestyle that is not just looking forward to heaven, but informing how we live on the earth. And Christianity can challenge societal norms and call for justice, economically and societally, and compassion, even in the face of a world that many of us, I think, would say is dominated by materialism. And James reminds us that material possessions, though necessary often, are fleeting. They will not last. And the call here is for you and I to recognize that what we have is a gift from God, and we should use our resources, no matter what they may be, wisely, especially to help those in need. And I can imagine maybe a pushback that someone may have when reading this, when they think, I'm not rich. I would not call myself rich. In fact, I'm very, very far from rich. And so this just doesn't apply to me. This applies to someone else, a group of people other than me. Okay, well, let's assume that maybe that's true. Perhaps some of us are off the hook if we don't fall in this or that economic category. Now, I think that if we say that, when we actually consider what James is saying, that's not really gonna stick, because we have to consider not just the fact that these people are being called rich, but what is the motivation of this group of people? The motivation is greed, isn't it? Wanting more and more and more. And the more you get, the more you want. And don't we all struggle with that in our own special and unique ways? See, greed is not a vice for the wealthy. Just the same way that generosity is not a privilege of the wealthy. Greed is not just a sin for those with lots of digits in their bank account. One Bible commenter calls greed a cursed love of having. And in a culture infatuated with things, I'd bargain that a vast majority of people struggle with having a cursed love of having. Struggle with the temptation of more. I'll give you an example from my own life that is both true and kind of dumb. So I got into running last year. And I don't know if there's a better way to say that someone's approaching 40 than to say I got into running last year. Just no hobbies left. And when I started running, I started kind of obsessing over all of the gear and things involved in doing anything other than the activity. I wonder if you guys have experienced that at all. And so I started obsessing over researching getting the right shoes. And I would be out running. The first thing I would notice is the shoes that people were running with. Like, oh, those are nice shoes. And I'd be like looking them up and like researching, how they would help me run faster, even though that's totally probably not true. And when you get the right shoes, then, of course, you have to get the smartwatch that goes with it. And then you have to get the gear and the running hat. I brought my hat with me today to show you. It says runner on it in case you don't notice it while I'm wearing it running. Now, this is a silly example. Like, I realize that it's kind of a joke on me. But even with something silly like this, I have to acknowledge, I have to have the self-awareness that motivating this is a subtle discontent, right? A lurking maybe greed in my heart that whispers, you need that. You deserve that. This will make you run 10 seconds faster. And now, I wouldn't consider myself rich, but listen, when I open up the Bible, part of me should always say, God, what do you have to say to me in my situation, in my circumstances? What is the principle that I have to better learn and live out? And what area of my heart is secretly sick with pride? Now, the thing I don't intend is for this to be just a guilt trip on people, right? This isn't saying you should feel bad about yourself. But each of us, I think if we're serious about following the way of Jesus, we need realignment daily in our thoughts and our desires. Okay, Jesus talks about this. Paul talks about this. All throughout the New Testament, it is the daily dying to self, picking up your cross. And I don't care if you've been a Christian since before you could walk. Okay, this is a daily realignment of what my thoughts are fixed on and what the desires of my heart are planted in. So let's finish out with reading the last few verses 4 through 6 of chapter 5. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived here on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. So here's the progression of these verses as simply as I can put it to you. Okay, number one, pride. Okay, the I deserve, I'm in control, leads to greed, the I want, which leads often to injustice. So pride, which leads to greed, which leads to injustice. The I'm willing to use whomever or whatever to get what I want. Now, this can be true of individuals. This can be true of groups, governments, and societies. And as Christians, it's very, very clear that part of our job on earth is to fight against injustice, not create more of it in our world. And the condemnation here is of these greedy individuals that have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence, the wages of whose backs you've gotten rich off of, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and I, God of the universe, have heard them. Now, one of the things I notice, and it's not explicitly said, but I think is implied, is it doesn't say that these workers who have been oppressed are Christians, are God-fearing people, but the cries of the oppressed move the heart of God. If you have been oppressed, if you have been treated unfairly, Scripture says God's heart is for you. We live in a world overflowing with injustice, but one of God's mysterious and beautiful promises is to make all things new. I don't understand how it's going to work. I would offer that you probably don't either. I don't have many answers when it comes to injustices other than I believe each of us can work to cultivate good in our world, to seek to serve rather than to be served, to fight for a more just, more equitable, more compassionate world to live in, and leave the things that we can't change, the things that we can't control, which by all accounts is a lot. We leave those into the hands of God. Now, I know this is a lot to consider, and so as we begin to kind of wrap up and try to bring this to a close, I want to take a few minutes to consider a few ways that we can respond to the wisdom that James shares with us in these verses. Now, the series that we're going through is called Act Like You Believe, and so what action can we take? What action can we put behind our beliefs today and this week? I'm going to suggest 3 things. These are not the only options. And the first one's going to sound very, very strange. I want you to consider to pray for small daily humiliations. One of my favorite writers and Bible teachers said this in one of his books. He said, "For years, I've prayed for one good humiliation a day. And then I watch my reaction to it. Nothing else better reveals my inflated pride and ego." I heard another pastor say, the best barometer of spiritual maturity is to see how someone reacts when they don't get their way. Now, I don't know about you, I'm kind of a fragile person. It doesn't take much to bruise my ego. So that's why this is a small daily humiliation. And this isn't out of self-hatred, this is not out of self-loathing, and it's certainly not out of shame. And understand that as Christians, we balance a view that we are made in the image of God and that we have more value, worth, and dignity than we could possibly imagine. But balanced with that is a posture of humility, of service, of love to those who are difficult to serve and love. And you know, the words humility and humiliation are actually come from the same source. Now, how many parents in here know that it is not comfort and ease that creates strong, kind, and loving kids? I know that that's true. Right. It's often what? It's often difficulty. It's often struggle. It's not getting it right. It's making mistakes. And as parents, we're like, oh, I want to save them. I want to tell them the right thing to do, but we hold back, right? Because we want them to learn. We want them to make the mistake, and then hopefully realize, I don't want to do that again. But then never learn unless what? They have the freedom to make it. Every athlete understands that muscle is not built by comfort and ease and seeing other people work out, right? It's through stress and discomfort and actually tearing the muscle itself down. My question is, why should it be any different for our spiritual life? Like the way I think about it, and this is like a picture into my brain, this is a little strange. It's like the daily pricks of the balloon that is my inflated head and ego. That's necessary for me to realign my thoughts and desires. That remind me, right, I'm not God. I'm not here to be served. I'm here to love and not judge. That following Christ, as one author put it, is a race to the bottom. To outserve each other, to outdo one another in showing honor, to outforgive. The second response is to practice thanksgiving. So this is about being content with what we've been giving by actively giving thanks. It's not just feeling thankful, it's practicing thanksgiving. And I think this means starving the desire for more. Stop believing the lie that more of something material will add to something immaterial. Have you guys ever thought about it like that? Like, why do we put so much hope in material things, money, another car, another house, another relationship, to add to something like happiness, which is immaterial? Now, I am objectively bad at math, but that to me just does not compute that more of one thing would add to more of another. Lord knows I've tried. Still, even today, I will probably have an opportunity to say oh, that'll probably make me happier, right? And then be disappointed by it in some way. There's 1,000 ways that we experience, we place our hopes in this little or this big thing to make us more content, more peaceful, more full of joy. And what? It just always in some way doesn't live up to the hopes that we place upon it. Giving thanks to God for even the breath in my lungs sets up our days to see everything as a gift, which it is. So third and lastly, our response to James is that we can fight for justice by doing justice. So this is a reference to the book of Micah 6:8. Many of you know what that says, where the prophet says, "What does God require of you, O man, but to what? But to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God." Now, there are injustices, large and small, all around us, at school, at work, in our community, our state, and our country. And maybe the best summary of justice that I've heard was made by a group called the Bible Project. Have you guys seen any of these Bible Project videos? They're awesome. And what I want to do as we close is I want to actually read part of the narration of their explanation of justice. And I encourage you to watch the whole thing on your own. Here's what it says. Abraham's family, the Israelites, ended up as immigrant slaves being oppressed unjustly in Egypt. And so God confronted Egypt's evil, declaring them to be guilty of injustice, and so rescued Israel. But the tragic irony is that these redeemed people went on to commit the same acts of injustice against the vulnerable. But they were not the only ones. There's injustice everywhere. Some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures that they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves. So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones. And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them. The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways. If God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others. This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems. This is what Jesus meant by saying, love your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you humans what is good and what the Lord requires of you. It's to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Would you pray with me? God, we read these words of your servant James, and they're tough to hear. They can often convict. They can feel like, even in some way, they're condemning. God, even when we read through parts of your word that are difficult, we know that your Spirit helps us, God, not merely to see where we're failing, but to see how through your strength we can move even in small steps towards Christ's likeness. So God, I trust that for as diverse a group of people we have in this room, your word can speak in specific ways to each one of them, to their struggles, to the situations that they are dealing with that no one knows about, that your word is faithful to speak into their lives in a way that says, this is the path, this is the way to move forward. God, we thank you that you never require perfection, and that, God, your specialty is working in weakness. So, God, may we not try to hide areas where we failed or that we're struggling or that we feel weak, but present it to you, knowing that that is what you love to work with. God, it's not our strength, but it's the ways in which we struggle and feel weak. And we trust that you take all things, wasting nothing, but working all for your good in our life, in our hearts, in our thoughts, in our families, in our workplaces, in our school, and in our communities. We come humbly before you, giving thanks for who you are, for what you have done, what you will continue to do in each of us and in this church. We pray this in your name. Amen.